Good evening, everyone. It's so great to see you in person. The last presentation I did for you was on Zoom, and I would much rather see the audience and be able to talk to them personally. Tonight, I'm going to present a two-part talk. The talk is entitled Birds and Beasts of Africa. But on the first part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about the wildebeest migration. I know this is an Audubon group, and you guys are our bird group, but I assume because you love nature that you will be fascinated by the wilderness wildebeest migration. It's the most incredible experience in nature that I have ever had. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about some birds that I saw on two different trips to Botswana and share some of that with you. But let's start with the wildebeest migration. And this story begins in Kenya, but specifically in the Masai Mara Reserve in Kenya, which is part of the Serengeti Ecosystem. And the Serengeti Ecosystem has incredible biodiversity. It supports the largest migrating herds of ungulates in the world. And that migration is sometimes referred to as the Great Migration. And it includes 1.3 million wildebeest, 200,000 zebra, and 440,000 Thompson's gazelle. It's the largest mass movement of animals on the planet. And of course, if you have so many herbivores, you're going to have a lot of carnivores. The spotted hyena is the most numerous large carnivore, and you are guaranteed to see them. But in addition to the spotted hyena, there are numerous lions and numerous cheetahs, and the hyena, lion, and cheetah occupy almost every habitat within the ecosystem. And so you're more than likely to see them if you ever get a chance to go there. In woodland areas, you might get a chance to see leopards. We were very lucky to see this leopard that the guides called Lorian and her cub. We came across her a couple of times and watched her and her interactions with the cub. And that was a treat in itself. She's a beautiful leopard. So the Serengeti ecosystem is defined by the area across which wildebeest migrate. My images are coming from the Masai Mara National Reserve, and that represents the northeastern end of the migration, and the wildebeest are here during the dry season. Okay. But it also includes Serengeti National Park, which is in Tanzania, and in fact, this is the route of the wildebeest, mostly through Masai Mara and Serengeti National Park, but they also move through other protected areas as well as non-protected areas. So lions may seem more glamorous. Lions are one of the big five, but it's actually the wildebeest that drives the evolution and ecology of this largest savanna ecosystem in the world. The wildebeest is a keystone species in the Serengeti. And what I mean by keystone species, it's a species that other animals in the ecosystem depend on for their survival. And this migration covers 10,000 square miles. It covers a huge area. I was there between August 25th and September 3rd in Masai Mara National Preserve in 2019. And so I saw the end of the migration where they were moving across the Mara River and hitting the grasses that they graze on during the dry season. The mammal populations you see today in the Serengeti are very different than what you would have seen in the early 1960s. And this is because of a viral disease called rinderpest. Rinderpest is a viral disease of cattle. It occurs naturally in Asia. It was introduced to Ethiopia in 1887 by cattle brought in from India. And shortly after it was introduced, it killed over 95% of the cattle in the area, resulting in famine for the people that depended on cattle for their livelihood. It also impacted animals that are closely related to cattle, such as the African buffalo and the wildebeest. And rinderpest decimated populations of these two species. However, rinderpest disappeared in the early 1960s due to a vaccination program that stopped outbreaks in cattle. And so if we look at what happens after this vaccination program, in 1961, there were 15,000 African buffalo. By 5 years later, the population had more than doubled to over 35,000. An even more dramatic effect was seen with wildebeest. In 1961, the wildebeest population was 260,000. 17 years later, in 1977, it was 1.4 million. The population grew exponentially. The population quadrupled and then leveled off to the carrying capacity of 1.3 million. Well, when you get an increase in herbivores like that, you're going to get changes to the ecosystem. And those include shorter grasses. You have a lot more grazers, and so they're keeping the grasses shorter. And shorter grasses mean fewer fires. And fewer fires had a huge impact because with fewer fires, tree saplings were able to develop into trees rather than being burned. And eventually, those trees developed into woodlands. And woodlands support different species than grasslands. You had more birds, you had more animals like elephants, and you have more animals like giraffes. And so with an increase in the wildebeest, you get an increase in the biodiversity of the Serengeti. It truly is a keystone species. The carrying capacity is 1.3 million. Okay. That's more numerous than all other herbivores combined. Well, what causes it to level out? How is the population density of wildebeest regulated? To understand that, I have to talk a little bit about the pyramid of biomass. I think we all know that solar energy is the ultimate source of energy for life on the planet. And plants are able to use that solar energy in a process called photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, plants convert solar energy to food energy, and that food energy is consumed by herbivores. And of course, herbivores support population of predators or carnivores. But if you notice the pyramidal shape of this, the pyramidal shape indicates that there's going to be more plants than there are herbivores, and there's going to be more herbivores than there are carnivores. And so let me explain why. Okay, these different levels on this pyramid of biomass are called trophic levels or feeding levels. And the energy transfer from one trophic level or feeding level to another is 10%, which means 90% of the energy is lost either as heat or in feces. And so if you have 10,000 pounds of plants in your ecosystem, you're going to support 10%. I'm sorry, if you have 100,000 pounds of plants in your ecosystem, you're going to support 10% of 100,000, which you get by dropping the zero. So 100,000 pounds of plants will support 10,000 pounds of herbivores. And 10,000 pounds of herbivores with that 10% energy transfer will support 1,000 pounds of carnivores. So again, you're going to have more plants than herbivores and more herbivores than carnivores because of the efficiency of this energy transfer. There are two types of population regulation. When animals are completely regulated by the amount of food in the system, when they're completely regulated by the amount of plants in the ecosystem, that is called bottom-up population regulation. At the other extreme, when the number of herbivores is completely controlled by predators, by predation, then that is an example of top-down population regulation. And so we can look at some graphs where it shows percent predation And predation, remember, is top-down regulation as a function of body size. And so a very small antelope called the arobi, the impala, and the topi are 100% regulated by predation, okay? Which means they're basically completely regulated by top-down regulation. And so why are these Thompson's gazelles running? Well, look what's coming over the hill. The predators. These are 3 of 5 cheetahs that came over the hill to start hunting these Thompson's gazelles. Okay. And again, predation is an example of top-down regulation. The impala is 100% regulated by predation. That's top-down regulation. And here you can see a cheetah feeding on an impala it recently killed. George Schaller did the first study of lions in the Serengeti between 1966 and 1969. And he showed that lions depend on migrant wildebeest for their survival. Because when wildebeest are in their territories, there's abundant food. And when there's abundant food, they produce lots of cubs. And when we were there during the migration with the wildebeest in their territories, we saw lots of lion cubs. I think we saw lion cubs every day of the trip, which is really one of the highlights of the trip because it is just so cute to watch these guys interact with each other and interact with their mother. If we get into some bigger animals, such as the zebra and the African buffalo, the topi is an antelope that's 100% regulated by predation. The zebra is a little bigger than a topi, and it is 75% regulated by predation, which means it's 25% regulated by the amount of food available. The buffalo, an even bigger animal, is only 25% regulated by predation, which means it's 75% regulated by the amount of food in the ecosystem. Well, what about really big animals? What about the mega herbivores? Mega herbivores include the hippopotamus, the giraffe, the rhino, and the African elephant. And these are all big animals. And it turns out that the mega herbivores are basically 100% regulated by the amount of food in the ecosystem. And that is an example of bottom-up regulation. And so again, bottom-up regulation is basically they're regulated by the amount of photosynthesis, by the amount of plants that you have in the ecosystem. Well, what about wildebeest? Well, I mentioned for the migratory population, the carrying capacity is 1.3 million. But it turns out that there's 2 separate groups of wildebeest in the Serengeti ecosystem. You have 1.3 million migrants, but you have 5,000 non-migrants or residents in 4 different populations. And so the question is there going to be a difference in population regulation between the migrants and the non-migrants? And it turns out that there is. The residents or non-migrants are primarily regulated by predators, primarily top-down regulation. 87% of the deaths in non-migrants or residents is due to predation. If you look at the migrants, only 25% of their deaths is due to predation, which means the primary factor that controls the number of migrant wildebeest is food, the amount of plants in the ecosystem. Well, why is that so? It turns out that predators can't follow the migrants. A baby lion takes 6 weeks before it can follow its mother. Okay. However, the non-migrants are sharing their territories with predators for the entire year, where the migrants migrate into and out of the territories of predators. And then I mentioned food is a factor in determining the number of migrants. And here we have January, early in the year. That is when the wildebeest are in the southern end of the range in what is called the short grass plains, okay? And they're in the short grass plains during the rainy season. They're in the short grass plains during the monsoon season. Okay? And that's because the wildebeest is a short grass specialist. It favors short mat-forming grasses. And it actually stimulates the growth of those grasses by the trampling it does in the habitat, as well as the manure and the urine it deposits, which fertilizes the grasses. However, when the monsoon rains stop, the growth of the grass stops, and the soil dries out. And as that soil dries out, the grasses dry out and become nutrient poor. And so that forces the wildebeest to seek other areas to feed. But when they are in their optimal habitat, when they are in the short grass plains during the monsoon season, that is when they produce their calves. And wildebeest produce over 500,000 calves over a 3-week period. That's 24,000 calves a day. And wildebeest are very different than other antelope because they don't hide their calves. They can't. They're in the short grass plains. Well, how do they avoid predation? Well, the calves are preyed on, but so many calves are born in a short period of time that the predators can only take a small percentage of them. And that phenomenon where you drop all your calves at the same time is called predator swamping. So as I mentioned, the grass dries out quickly after the rainy season, and so the wildebeest move to longer grasslands in areas that have higher rainfall during the dry season. And during the driest part of the dry season, they have to hit the grazing grounds in Masai Mara National Reserve, which means they have to cross the Mara River. So I was there in August and September. I was in the Mara during August and September. And that's in this area, you get the highest amount of rainfall during the dry season. And so that's where the wildebeest were. And that's why this trip was planned at that time. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to share a little video clip from a film entitled Serengeti, Nature's Living Laboratory. This is about 1.5 minutes, but I think it will help you understand this phenomenon. So let me play this video for you.
GPS scholars tell us. If we put on the dry season locations of animals, what we see is this huge congregation up in the north. And the north is where there's the highest amount of rainfall in the dry season.
Once again, the GPS collars reveal that the wildebeest herds seem to be following the rainfall. But as they move north to reach the best grazing grounds, the Mara River stands in their way. When rain falls on the opposite side of the Mara, the wildebeest have a choice to make. The lure of new rain and fresh grass is powerful, but every crossing carries the risk of drowning or an encounter with one of the Mara's infamous crocodiles. But even in the north, the rains and green grass don't last forever.
You can imagine this whole system is drying out slowly. Imagine a grape becoming a raisin. And everybody's keeping an eye out for the new rain.
When the monsoon rains return, the wildebeest herds once more move south toward the shortgrass plains, where the cycle begins again.
And so the wildebeest have to cross the Mara River, and it's dangerous to cross the Mara River. More than 60,000 wildebeest are killed each year crossing this waterway. A significant number drowned, some are taken by predators. But realize when you have a population of 1.3 million, 60,000 being killed crossing the Mara River is insignificant. And so here's another video that's about 1 minute that I want to show you that a gal that was with me on this photography trip took while we were waiting to, while we were watching the wildebeest and waiting for them to cross the Mara River. Just to give you, it really can't completely convey the smells and the sounds and the dust, but maybe give you a little bit of a feeling of what it was like for someone like you or me to be there.
Okay, here we are. We're starting to cross. We're gathering.
Can you hear them?
And there's a lion on the other side that's going to probably attack someone. It just takes one to go in.
So they started crossing, and we saw the entire spectacle. Here you can see a Nile crocodile taking a wildebeest. Here you can see a lion that was waiting on the other side of the river taking a wildebeest. And then you can see the massive numbers of wildebeest that are crossing. We saw several crossings. This is one of several crossings that we got to see on this trip. So why migrate? Well, it turns out that migration allows them to find food without being eaten. It allows them to find food during the dry season, and it allows them to avoid a significant amount of predation. And with the wildebeest, you also see zebra crossing the river with them. 200,000 zebras also migrate, and we saw zebras crossing the river at every crossing that we observed the wildebeest crossing the river. The Serengeti ecosystem supports one of the last remaining migrations of large mammals on the planet. And it's an absolutely incredible thing to see. And if you have any interest, it's not cheap to go there, but I encourage you to save your pennies and try and get an opportunity to see this phenomenon. The Serengeti is pretty much like it was during the days of hunters and gatherers. It's a relatively pristine system. There are some threats to the system that may affect the system in our lifetimes. So again, I urge you to think about going to Kenya during the migration and trying to see this phenomenon. So to summarize, migrations of all species create superabundance. You've got 1.3 million wildebeest in the Serengeti. That's more wildebeest than all the other herbivores combined. Think about sandhill cranes. Migrants' travels allow them to take advantage of fresh, high-quality food. And because of that, migratory animals can become 10 times numerous than members of the same species who do not migrate. Okay. So that is the end of part 1 of this talk. And in part 2, I'm going to talk about some birds that I saw on 2 different trips to Botswana. Thank you for your time.